I said I wasn't going to be doing another YouTuber is wrong video, but here I am, infuriated at Captain Midnight's Netflix has to change video.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Netflix has been the talk of the town recently, with cracking down on password sharing and stock prices dropping like bricks in the air. I probably wouldn't have wanted to make a full video on this topic, as I have a bigger Streaming Wars video coming out next week, but YouTube recommended some videos that made me go,
I disagree, Gary.
So here we are. And to be clear, Netflix does have a lot of problems, but the way people are coming out of the woodwork to make almost fictitious arguments about how the company is going to go under is a little laughable to me, for the simple reason that I don't think people understand Netflix as a company. Before getting into this, I'd like to remind people that the whole reason we're here in the Streaming Wars is because of Netflix's existence. If it weren't for them, maybe we're watching Squid Game on the Sci-Fi Network with 12 commercials of Mountain Dew and ED pills. I say this because other streamers have had the benefit of using Netflix to learn from their history for how to make a streaming service. And on top of this, Netflix, because it's existed forever, is always going to have a harder time gaining subscribers comparatively because everyone already has Netflix. It is also worth noting before getting into this that although Netflix made headlines for losing 200K subs in their first quarter, a first for the company in 10 years, according to Variety, Netflix said that not accounting for the losses in Russia, where the streamer cut services over the country's invasion of Ukraine, it would have added 500K subscribers in quarter one. A factoid that seems to be omitted completely from a lot of articles and definitely missed from people only reading a negative headline to dance on Netflix's loss. The biggest strength of this service at the moment are its commitments to animation for an older audience and somehow hooking me in on almost every dumb reality show it comes out with every other month. But there definitely is a lot more being spent to inflate Netflix's content to try to disguise losing big IPs like Friends and The Office. Two shows that people love but come at an absurd cost for the studios that currently have them on their streaming platforms.
Maybe we could share one.
This city just showed you that it's full of people ready to believe in good.
But I instead want to use these two interesting videos I was recommended as a vehicle to go through some of their so-called problems people have discussed this week that feel kind of like a soft argument to me. In this video, I'll be going over two creators' videos in particular, one from Critical and the other the main focus of this video, Captain Midnight's Netflix is in Trouble video. And again, I'm not familiar with either of these two. Captain Midnight, I know I've seen a video from, I just can't remember which, but that is to say there's probably some nuances from their videos that I might miss. And again, this is no ill will to these people. I think people are really mad at Netflix for a variety of reasons, some valid and some not at all, and I'd like to get into that. With that out of the way, let's start with Critical. I'm a little less harsh on this video, mostly because he seems to acknowledge they will probably rebound as a company. He acknowledges an ad-supported model is not a bad idea. And I like the point that Netflix is something that isn't a need if bills are getting tighter, especially with competitors rising in the rankings. However, I do get a little bit of a chuckle when people bring up Arcane as a very popular and well-received show on Netflix.
Whereas something like Arcane, which was on Netflix, people were talking about the entire run. Every single episode, every drop was trending on Twitter with people talking about it.
And I don't mean to come off as a donkey, but like, here's Arcane compared to Red Notice, a movie literally no one on the internet talks about besides making fun of it. And just for reference, these charts will come up again later. Here's Red Notice and Arcane compared to a huge show like Succession. Red Notice is still killing it according to Google Trends, which aren't perfect, but just for the sake of comparison. But I do find this fascinating because the internet can make a show seem like it's way more universally popular than it actually seems sometimes. Like, I'm sure if I asked most non-movie diehards, they probably wouldn't know what The Green Knight was, while something like Squid Game is a show they'd at least recognize. I don't hear people talk about Arcane in real life nearly as much as the internet would make it out to be. Huge asterisk times. I'm wrong about Arcane globally, as it has a huge appeal in Southeast Asia, according to multiple reports. And I'm kind of getting conflicting details on how successful the series is in the United States, but it is enormous on a global level, but not to the level of some of Netflix's bigger hits like Squid Game. Just to add, this show did extremely well critically with the public, but I'm bringing up this point because for every Arcane, Netflix needs a Red Notice to hit multiple audiences. But the issue on a larger scale is if you trust these numbers from streaming services. Questioning streaming stats is kind of like opening Pandora's box. It makes things complicated quickly. Even with something I love, like Box Office, I bet you didn't know that A, they are estimates released by studios' own tracking, and B, only estimate Sunday's numbers for the weekend based on previous numbers. It's like if in an NBA game, they just let one of the coaches keep track of the score for the final quarter. But even looking at HBO, if you want to trust them, Our Flag Means Death, by all accounts, based on the numbers, is one of the most in-demand shows on the service, whatever that means. Which might seem shocking, it tops even Euphoria, which is especially weird considering HBO has not renewed said very successful show for a second season. Personally, I'm not going to question it anymore. This is just an acknowledgement of the numbers being a little suspect, but I'll bring back up Netflix's most popular shows in a second. Also, the point of the binge model versus episodic releases is something I'll go into more depth on why it can be misleading. But for the sake of Arcane, a show that was released on Netflix in 3 parts, it did not build upon itself even though tons of people were talking about it. There are multiple contributing factors, but it may have just been because people are accustomed to having all of their Netflix show released at one time.
Netflix is cracking down in what I believe to be the wrong area. They're just blaming everyone for password sharing, which is a legitimate problem from a business standpoint.
The password sharing bleeds into the Captain Midnight video, which I find a little ridiculous because it isn't a concrete idea that has been absolutely panned, even though it was only talked about something they could do at a shareholder meeting trying to keep people happy, which all big companies want. Like, HBO Max wants this to be a thing as much as Netflix does because it leads to more accounts in the long run. Whoever is bold enough to try it first definitely will face the most heat, but I don't know how many people who outright pay for Netflix would quit the service because other people mooching are no longer allowed to mooch. This would be like if in last summer when Disney Plus estimated a $6 million loss for the pirators of Black Widow, and they said they were cracking down on this. Most people that would be the most mad aren't paying for the film anyway, so why would Disney care? Like, you can be mad, yet that isn't affecting Netflix's bottom line unless the public is so negative about them as a whole. But as the saying goes, stranger things heals all wounds. Like, I'm not trying to sib for a big company or anything, but people will forget about this in a month, and if it happens, they'll forget about it again in 2 months. The only other point I'll throw out is at the start, Critical talks about how abominable the schlock Netflix puts out as content.
They're just this giant dumpster of almost unwatchable movies and shows, and it's things nobody is asking for. But they're putting a lot of money into making them for some reason.
And this kind of relates to the first point. Netflix benefits from hosting bad content. As much as people question how Adam Sandler and his buddies are making millions to make Hubie Halloween, there are millions of people still watching them. Bad reality shows, bad comedies, and freaking Red Notice in general get viewership on Netflix. Now, I will mention this is a dangerous game they are playing because while this stuff still gathers an audience, it definitely lowers the expectation of quality for a Netflix original. The question is, when do Bird Box's, Red Notices, and Ridiculous Sixes of their service cross a threshold of being the main thing they are known for when they stay on the front page and the top 10 of the service?
Captain Midnight.
But just going by the Google trends, it's easy to see that people talked about that first season a lot. It really dwarfs the searches for Succession Season 1 about half a year earlier. But then, something funny happened.
Something that I think is really indicative of a lot of Netflix's programming problems. Succession grew season after season. Word of mouth spread, weekly discussions as the show aired got livelier, and more people were watching every year.
Right off the bat, I knew I was in for a bit of a slanted opinion when Captain Midnight compares Russian Doll to Succession. Not only are these shows completely different, but I wouldn't consider Russian Doll to be a top-tier Netflix original, whereas Succession is definitely one of HBO's biggest ongoing shows. But on top of this, this chart used cuts off at April 16th, which is before Russian Doll Season 2 had even released. I don't think this was on purpose, but if you take the current trends, or even, the week it actually released, you'll notice a significant increase in the numbers for this show based on Google Trends. But even ignoring these things, I feel like the context is lost in trying to compare these shows. Like I mentioned, Russian Doll was not one of Netflix's top shows, and they release a ton of shows on top of them taking a 4-year break in their release schedule for a second season. Succession, on the other hand, just hit its stride right before the pandemic started and ended on a great cliffhanger for season 2. If only people had a reason for catching up on 2 seasons of a show that got great buzz towards the end of 2019 before it started another season in 2021. If only. Succession, much like a lot of quarantine shows, benefited from its release by sheer luck, but also an incredible finale that really got people talking. There are simply not that many shows able to do this.
Where shows like Succession, The Mandalorian, and Euphoria can hold on to an audience and grow fan passion over time, Netflix doomed a lot of its own shows to being flash in the pans, even when they're good enough to deserve better.
This is clearer later on, but this is kind of how shows that are huge staples of the culture go. If you don't captivate an audience, you lose viewers slowly and start to decline unless there's a huge turnaround. And then on top of that, the talent getting more expensive later on in a show's life cycle, which leads to... Chart time?
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
It's worth noting Google Trends, as mentioned earlier, aren't the be-all end-all to anything, but can be really helpful for the sake of lousy internet arguments. This bothers me to no end because people are grabbing random shows and saying, see, this means I'm right. Let's make one thing clear. An episodic release is not a binary thing. Here's a list of shows compared with Russian Doll and Succession. As you can see, a show like Pam and Tommy, which released episodically, dropped off a cliff after its premiere with 3 episodes. Book of Boba would have taken a similar colossal dive if it weren't for Disney pressing the Baby Yoda button to save their series. And even shows like Our Flag Means Death and Severance got a slow climb with consistent talk even after they were completed because of great word of mouth on these shows. To give another example with Made for Love, a show literally no one has seen, but I'm a Kristen Milioti fan because she deserved better for a series that we don't have time to talk about in this video. But the point is, this show has had a slow decline as it was still releasing episodes each week. And HBO still renewed this show even based on this. To me, this shows a solid correlation that a successful week-to-week show will have enough fans talking about the show as well as fans catching up because they hear the hype about it. However, when a show makes you question if it's worth keeping up with it, that's when the drop-off occurs. The Netflix counter to this is when a show is dropped all at once, someone that weekend will have a say on if it's worth watching all of it, and if the ending sucks, someone will probably mention this. By all accounts, WandaVision was an extremely popular show that I think devolved into something it didn't start as towards the end of the series. Had it had come out all at once on Netflix, maybe I would have been a little bit more hesitant to have watched it all. I bring this up because episodic stuff has a lot more variety to it than people would make it seem. This, compared to some enormous releases on Netflix, kind of puts in perspective just how many eyeballs something just releasing on Netflix can give it. Like, here's HBO's slate of shows, minus Euphoria because it screws literally everything up. But to compare that with Netflix shows charts, while yes, it does peak then plummet very quickly, that's kind of what the model should do. But showing them in comparison to HBO Max, you'll see that while they aren't given that slow build, they still do reach the same highs or even higher than that of HBO Max releases. And this is just US trends. Once you go worldwide, Netflix dominates compared to HBO's releases, which is something to consider how big their platform is on a global scale. By the way, if you're wondering why I left off Squid Game, A, the trends are incorrect on the series tag, and B, if you search by just the term, it makes everything in its wake minuscule in comparison, even surpassing Euphoria's highest point.
Better Call Saul, a show produced by Sony, just started its 6th and final season on AMC here in America and on Netflix in much of the rest of the world. Does anyone seriously think this series would have made it that far if it was an actual Netflix original?
I don't want to sugarcoat it. This is dumb. Better Call Saul, a show that is beloved, rode the coattails of Breaking Bad, a show that got extremely popular because A, it was incredibly good, and B, it was one of the first premiere shows that would be on Netflix later. That's the reason I and so many other friends of mine were able to get into it, because it was available on Netflix and not on a paywalled channel on cable no one had. Netflix was probably ecstatic about Breaking Bad's numbers, and it would be in their best interest to keep Better Call Saul going, and Better Call Saul, much like Breaking Bad, heavily benefited from also being on Netflix for people to watch. But yeah, maybe they wouldn't be invested in keeping Breaking Bad spin-off around. It's not like they have a Netflix original movie that also is under the belt.
One anonymous animation producer described how when they first arrived, Netflix said they, quote, wanted to be the home of everyone's favorite show. But over time, that thesis changed to, quote, we want to make what the audience wants to see. This apparently led them to touting the Boss Baby series as their benchmark of success. For better or worse, everyone has heard of this baby who wears a suit. Whereas most Netflix series, especially animated shows, get barely any marketing at all.
I say this as the biggest supporter of Netflix's animation team, as it is one of, if not, the biggest plus for the streaming service I had. Netflix invested heavily in streaming and producing a ton of incredible original animated content, which I have found a ton of enjoyment out of. But at the same time, if we want to get into the financial sides of things, teen to adult animation just isn't talked about enough as it should be. We can want to keep this around, and I try to pitch these shows to my friends, but people simply aren't interested in their animated series that are also kind of expensive to make. Even HBO Max is a victim of this canceling later seasons of shows like Final Space and Infinity Train because it doesn't fit a target demo they want to chase after, even though Infinity Train has developed a devoted and vocal fan base that wants to see the series completed. Also keep in mind, Infinity Train released with a binge strategy for its current final season, and no one batted an eye, because who cares? Animation just constantly isn't appreciated enough, and to single out Netflix just feels like an oversight. Because while I can be excited for something as creative and interesting as Centaur World, I can also recognize that something cheaper and quicker like a Boss Baby series produced by DreamWorks is a safer option for them to go.
Of shotgun blasting as many TV shows and movies onto the platform as they can with very little promotion just feels like a failing one, not to mention incredibly expensive. For every hit like Stranger Things, a show that costs $30 million an episode, by the way.
I've seen everybody bring up how Stranger Things Season 4 shouldn't cost $30 million an episode, a number that has been brought up by, quote, people close to the show. And usually it's like they completely forgot they brought up, hey wait, stop canceling shows. Like Captain Midnight mentions earlier that he likes fully expanded worlds that are given time to be fleshed out, but then goes on to bring up this figure as something to be baffled at. You have to pick a lane. Talent costs money, and the further you get in a series, the bigger star power the talent has, and the more money it costs to keep them around on a show. This is one of the reasons Netflix will end a show early, because at present moment, it doesn't make sense for them to continue all of their series when the big winners will shine for more seasons to come. There's a reason Reggae Jean will continue to get the Brinks truck.
With all these recent price hikes, something had to give. So Netflix announced on an earnings call that it would be introducing a subscription tier with ads at a lower price point. I don't know how successful this will be, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it was kind of a tough sell.
This is another dumb argument that I kind of get. If HBO didn't do this earlier this year. Netflix is just the most popular service, so maybe it's just under a microscope, but almost every streaming service has a paid ad-supported service, even if it wasn't intended to have ads running on it in the first place. For me, it seems worth the $5 extra a month, so me and my family aren't bombarded by a yogurt commercial every 10 minutes while watching The Batman the way Matt Reeves intended. And I think for most people, that's a pretty low-stakes decision to make. That doesn't matter.
I mean, all it takes is watching an Arrested Development episode that aired on Fox versus one that was released on Netflix to see that maybe being forced to cut things and have really disciplined editing actually helps shows more than it hinders them in a lot of cases.
This is an interesting point that I probably won't dive fully in on because there's a lot of ways to go on good versus bad of studio intervention. Arrested Development is a great example of a show that was able to work even with the restrictions of cable, but this isn't always a one-to-one. To go on the opposite end, Edgar Wright left Ant-Man because he felt like he had no control over his own creative vision and went on to make Baby Driver, a uniquely Edgar Wright heist film that has his team's signature flair all over it. I just don't think creative freedom and restrictions is something that can strictly be boiled down to a binary based on one example.
Showrunners like Maniac's Cary Fukunaga have even admitted as much, saying that Netflix never wants to lose, quote, binging momentum, and that the algorithm's argument is gonna win at the end of the day. So whatever creative constraints have been imposed by car commercials and insurance ads have just been replaced by far more machine-driven ones over at Netflix.
This goes with the previous point, but when views drive the success of the show, of course Netflix is going to want you to stick around. Maybe if it's every episode ending on something big, it can feel a bit repetitive. But this is also seen with episodic content, often ending on a big moment to keep you coming back for the following week. All of these drive viewership, and while different restrictions aren't really different from one another.
Between their dump everything all at once model and their lack of promotion, they're killing a lot of shows. I think it's probably time for Netflix to act a little less like a tech company that's riding high off of an unlimited supply of investor money, and more like a real studio that does everything it can to set up its productions for success. Shows like Succession and Yellowstone, as different as they are from each other, show that there's still a lot of value in really getting behind a series for the long haul.
Keep in mind, getting behind shows like Succession and Yellowstone, but also paying for Stranger Things is bad. Netflix has big shows that are in its infancy of their lifetime of something that could go on for 7+ seasons. Things like Bridgerton, Money Heist, Lupin, and even more possible seasons for Squid Game all seem to be overlooked to push the narrative that Netflix is out here canceling shows willy-nilly, when they are no different than a ton of other studios just reading the numbers. I just think people really want to be mad at Netflix for a couple weeks, whether it be hiking of prices, the possibility of password sharing crackdown, or maybe even the incessant pushing of Is It Cake. But honestly, I kind of get why people are mad. Netflix was seen as the hero combating cable packages, but as other corporations adapted, suddenly Netflix is no longer the innovator it once was. But I do find it perplexing that people seem heated that Netflix is releasing too much content, especially people citing other services like Apple TV, which did have a great first quarter and a Best Picture win, kind of, but at the same time, these services are not comparable, as Apple TV has legit 20 things on its service. Netflix is funding so many projects because everyone is bound to find something to enjoy. As much as people want to clown on Red Notice or Is It Cake, they still do really well numbers-wise on Netflix. I think the internet can seem to overlook how big Netflix is as a streaming service. I know people have been calling their content lacking, but sometimes people need a dumb reality show like Love is Blind to watch and talk about with friends. Something literally no one has mentioned that Netflix greenlit 5 seasons and built from the ground up. And while you might not be interested in Love is Blind, you might want to watch Green Eggs and Ham, or Russian Doll, or Comey Can't Communicate, or The Adam Project, all of which are some of the shows released in the first quarter of this year.
This amount of variety is something that HBO is trying to keep while also still keeping their label of a prestigious service, which is difficult when you are now the platform that hosts Big Bang Theory, Free Guy, and Dear Evan Hansen. But this is something Netflix has thrown completely out the window.
Which they probably did because every other company saw the success Netflix was having off their own content and wanted to take it back for their own streaming services. And as these streaming services become more divided, separating their original content to platforms no one asked for, Netflix is still trying to create a semblance of what they originally set out to do, to be an answer to cable. I hope you enjoyed this video. I promise it will be the last of YouTuber is Wrong for at least a couple months this time. Make sure to be on the lookout for more streaming thoughts if this is up your alley. Also, I will have a bonus video for Everything Everywhere All at Once that you can watch this week if you're a patron with as little as $1 a month. If you really want to show Netflix what for, why not give me the whole subscription price, baby? I'll even let you password share on your account. As always, later haters.